Hi, I'm Paul Emerson, and I'm the owner of Emerson and Farrar and Van Craeynest. In the Van Craeynest brand, we use a different technique than modern technique. In the modern technique, we're using a wax model that's sometimes 3D printed and casting it using lost wax. In that technique, mass production is very easy. The Van Craeynest technique is completely different. The Van Craeynest technique uses a master model called a hub. The hub is sunk into another piece of metal called a die, and that die is then hardened steel. We utilize this model that was carved out of steel by hand in the 1920s to make a reproduction or to make a new vintage ring. So our first step is to take gold, melt it in a flask, and pour it into an ingot. We then take that ingot, clean it, and we put it through a process that extrudes it into a large piece of square wire. That piece of square wire goes through a rolling mill that's over 120 years old that originally was a hand crank mill and has been converted to 110 volts. Once we've done that, we trim it into the appropriate length pieces and we die strike it into a die. When we look at Van Craeynest and we look at why it's important, this is one of the last remaining companies that is doing die striking and the only company in the United States that's die striking Art Deco, Victorian, and Art Nouveau designs. What this means is we're the only ones left. There's no one else doing it, and it's really important to maintain this. Our studio, which I'm sitting in, is a working museum. After the piece has been die struck, it needs to be trimmed, annealed again, struck again, and then bent into the correct finger size and welded and then filed. All this takes a matter of about a day to make one of these rings and up to 8 days to make the ring that I'm wearing on my left hand, my wedding ring. It's very important to note that the techniques used here are all but lost in the modern jewelry making. Those techniques are die striking, not casting, die striking, chasing, piercing. All of these things are different than engraving. Engraving takes away metal, chasing moves metal. We use a hair-sized saw blade to pierce these designs. This technique allows us to create filigree that's very, very fine and very different than what would be done with a 3D printer, which would be very heavy. Each of these rings that we create is slightly different. No two rings are alike. When we polish a ring, we actually use a sanding block, a sanding stick with up to 1,000 grit sandpaper on it, emery cloth on it, before we start to polish it. That polishing that we do gets so fine that it's just a glass finish on the Van Craeynest piece that you buy. When you receive your Van Craeynest ring, it will be in a little leather Van Craeynest box, also designed in the same era that these pieces were designed in, but produced today. It's a work of art. I always say it's poetry in metal.